The wind howled across the barren ranch lands, carrying with it the scent of dust and old struggles, and in the middle of that endless horizon stood a young man named Eli Carter. Eli was only 21, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, yet his eyes always carried the weight of hunger and hardship. His family's land had shrunk to a patch of what it used to be, and every morning he rose with the sun to tend the cattle, knowing full well that the debts hanging over their ranch were larger than the herd he cared for. His father had passed away 2 winters ago, and since then, Eli had carried the responsibility of the land, his frail mother and his younger sister, Clara. But fate, as if mocking him, brought forth a burden he never asked for. To keep the land, he was forced into a marriage he didn't desire. The woman was Mrs. Margaret Halloway, twice his age, a wealthy widow who had inherited a large estate after her husband's sudden passing. Margaret was 42, sharp-eyed, with strands of silver running through her otherwise dark hair, and while she carried herself with grace, the townsfolk whispered that she was too old for love and that no young man in his right mind would marry her unless desperation drove him. Desperation, unfortunately, was Eli's middle name. The town banker made it clear his debts were to be called in, and unless he found a way to save his family's ranch, they'd lose everything. That's when Margaret, who had admired the Carter family's perseverance from afar, made her offer. She would settle Eli's debts and secure the Carter land, but in return, Eli would marry her. At first, Eli's pride burned hotter than the summer sun. The idea of marrying a woman who could have been his mother filled him with humiliation. Yet when he returned home and saw his sister's shoes worn through, his mother coughing in the cold, and the ranch nearly falling apart, he knew he had no choice. He agreed, though bitterness twisted in his chest as he slipped the plain gold ring onto Margaret's finger. Their wedding was small, hushed, attended only by a few close witnesses, but the gossip in town spread like wildfire. People laughed behind their backs, saying the poor rancher had sold himself, saying Margaret had bought herself a boy instead of a husband. Eli ignored them, or at least pretended to, burying his shame in hard work. But what he didn't expect was the quiet strength Margaret carried beneath her gentle smiles. She didn't demand affection from him, nor did she try to control his every move. Instead, she supported him. She rose with him before dawn, riding alongside him on the ranch, her skirts brushing against the saddle as she handled cattle with surprising skill. She paid off the debts and even invested in new equipment, helping Eli expand the ranch. At first, Eli felt nothing but obligation toward her. But as days turned into weeks, he began to notice little things, like the way she listened when he spoke about his dreams, how swift upon him, but more importantly, Eli finally felt the respect he had fought for, not because of his pride, but because of the life he had built with Margaret. Clara grew under Margaret's care, blossoming into a young woman with dreams of teaching, and Eli's mother lived her last days in peace, comforted by the knowledge that her son was not only provided for, but truly loved. One spring morning, as Eli rode out to the hills and looked back upon the ranch that stretched strong and whole behind him, he understood what had once been hidden from him, that he had not been forced into chains, but guided into blessings. Margaret had not stolen his youth, she had given it purpose. She had not clipped his wings, she had built him a home to return to. And when he returned that evening to find Margaret waiting at the door, her hair streaked with more silver, yet her smile brighter than ever, Eli took her into his arms without hesitation. He whispered against her ear, "They thought you were too old to give me life, but you've given me more than anyone ever could." She laughed softly, leaning into him, and in that moment, Eli knew their love was not bound by age nor by circumstance, but by the strength of 2 souls who had chosen each other against all odds. Their story became a tale not of scandal, but of devotion, a reminder to everyone who whispered and doubted that love, when true, only grows stronger with time. She respected his decisions even when she had the money and power to overrule him, and how she cared for Clara as if she were her own daughter. Eli began to see her not as a burden, but as a blessing. There was one night that changed everything. A storm had rolled in, fierce and unyielding, and lightning struck the pasture fence. Cattle panicked, stampeding in the dark, and Eli rushed out in the rain, trying desperately to control the chaos. He nearly got trampled, his boot caught in the mud, when suddenly Margaret was there. She grabbed the reins of a wild horse, steadied it with fearless determination, and pulled Eli to safety. Her strength stunned him. Soaked to the bone, they returned to the ranch house breathless, and as she tended to his bruises, Eli looked at her differently for the first time. Not as a woman twice his age, not as the person he had been forced to marry, but as the partner who had saved his life. That night, in the soft glow of the firelight, something shifted between them. She admitted quietly that she hadn't married him out of pity, but because she saw in him the kind of man her late husband had never been, a man who worked hard, who cared for his family, who never gave up despite impossible odds. Eli listened, his heart stirring, realizing that the woman he had once resented was the very reason he still had a home, a ranch, and a future. Slowly, love blossomed, not the fiery, impulsive kind of love that burns and fades, but a deep, steady flame that grew stronger with time. The townsfolk who once mocked them began to envy what they saw. Margaret glowed with a new youth, her laughter returning, while Eli carried himself with pride and gratitude. Together they expanded the ranch, turning it into one of the most prosperous in the region. They opened their doors to struggling neighbors, offering work, food, and shelter. Margaret taught Clara how to read and sew, while Eli gave Clara the gift of stability, something she had never known before. Soon Eli realized he had gained more than just a wife. He had gained a companion, a teacher, a protector, and a love that defied every whisper in town. Margaret had given him more than he ever dreamed. Not just land, not just survival, but a life worth living. And when he finally took her hand one quiet evening, looking into her eyes as the sun dipped below the hills, he whispered, "I thought I was giving up my freedom the day I married you, but now I see that was the day I gained everything." The story of Eli and Margaret became more than gossip. It became a legend in their town, proof that love does not bow to age, pride, or circumstance. Proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. The ranch had grown under their combined hands, but growth often invited storms greater than the weather, and as autumn bled into winter, Eli began to feel the true weight of being both husband and rancher. Though love had begun to warm his heart for Margaret, he still fought against the whispers of the town that clung to him like shadows. Men his age, rugged and free, teased him in the saloon, muttering that he was living in comfort while they broke their backs, kept by a woman who was old enough to be his mother. The bitterness of their words stirred doubts in Eli's chest, but each time he returned home, Margaret's steady gaze pulled him back to himself. She never asked him to prove his worth, never doubted his strength, but Eli, young and proud, still wrestled with the need to stand tall in the eyes of others. One evening, after a long day of hauling feed and repairing fences, he sat by the fire with Margaret, and she told him stories of her late husband, not with longing but with lessons, of the mistakes he made, of how wealth and arrogance had blinded him, and how Eli was nothing like him. "You are not what they whisper," she said softly, pouring him coffee with the same care she gave to every soul on the ranch. "You are more." That night, Eli kissed her hand for the first time without hesitation, and Margaret's smile lit the room brighter than the flames. But just as life began to feel settled, trouble arrived in the form of James Wexler, a wealthy land baron who had long coveted both Margaret's estate and the Carter Ranch. He came with false charm, dressed in fine coats, offering to buy the land Eli and Margaret had worked so hard to preserve. When they refused, his mask slipped, and he warned Eli that boys who marry above their station tend to fall harder when they stumble. From that day, cattle went missing, fences were cut in the night, and whispers turned into accusations that Eli was stealing from neighbors. The town began to turn cold toward him, and for the first time since their marriage, Margaret saw the old bitterness return to Eli's eyes, yet she did not let it consume him. She stood by his side in the town hall, speaking with a voice both firm and elegant, declaring that no one would tarnish the name of the man who worked harder than anyone among them. Her words silenced the room, and Eli, though young, stood taller because of her. Still, the attacks did not stop. One freezing night, the barn was set ablaze, and Eli nearly lost half the herd trying to drive them out of the flames. His hands blistered, his lungs choked with smoke. But Margaret refused to let despair claim him. She tended his wounds herself, holding his face in her palms, whispering that they would rebuild, that fire could not take what love had built between them. Eli realized then that Margaret's love was not just soft comfort, It was fierce, unyielding, the kind of love that carried him when he thought he could not stand. Together they rebuilt the barn, and neighbors who had once doubted him came to help, moved by the strength of a woman who had given everything for her, husband and a man who refused to quit. Slowly the tide turned. James Wexler's schemes were exposed when one of his hired men confessed, and justice came.